The human in the dragon's lair. The air in the cavern was thick, cold, and heavy with the scent of ancient stone and damp earth. The sound of distant growls echoed through the tunnels, making the ground beneath the prisoner tremble. The dragon's lair was legendary. It was a place where even the bravest of warriors had fallen. And yet, here was a human, unlike any the aliens had ever encountered, standing, unbowed, at the entrance of this terrifying abyss. The aliens had thought they could break him. They had seen humans as weak creatures, a mere nuisance in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But they underestimated him. They didn't know who he really was. He was tall, with broad shoulders that had been hardened through years of labor and combat. His face, though scarred, showed no fear. The human stood tall, his hands steady, despite the trembling of the ground. His clothes were torn, a few battle scars visible along his arms. But his eyes, they were what set him apart. There was a fire in them, a fire that could not be extinguished, no matter how many times he had been thrown into impossible situations. "Is he ready?" one of the aliens asked, his voice almost a whisper, though it didn't need to be. The human could hear everything. The commander nodded. "This is where he will either break or prove himself. The dragons will finish what we couldn't." The alien guards stepped back, watching with cold interest. They were certain the dragons would deal with the human quickly, just like they had dealt with many before. They hadn't expected the human to last long in their training camp, a place meant to break any prisoner into submission. The prisoner's eyes flicked toward the large, heavy door that slowly creaked open in front of him. Behind it, the growls grew louder, more fierce, more menacing. A low hiss echoed, vibrating the very stones of the cavern. Then they came. The dragons. Massive creatures, their scales gleaming like polished armor. Their eyes were glowing with hunger, their jaws capable of crushing bone with a single snap. These were no ordinary beasts. They were predators, the deadliest of their kind, feared across the galaxy. The human's heart did not race. He did not flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the anticipation of the oncoming battle. And yet there was no fear in him, only focus. The dragons stalked closer, their massive claws scraping against the floor, sending sparks flying. Their breaths were slow, deliberate, as they calculated the best time to strike. They moved like a pack, circling him. It was the human's first real test, and from the looks of it, the dragons were preparing to tear him apart in the most brutal way possible. But the human stood there, motionless, as though he were part of the cavern itself. The dragons closed in on him. One lunged, its jaws snapping with incredible speed. But the human didn't panic. He twisted to the side, the dragon's teeth barely missing him. He moved with a kind of precision and grace that the aliens had never expected from someone so fragile. The dragons growled in frustration, realizing that their prey was not going to be as easy as they thought. The human's movements were swift, calculated, almost as if he were anticipating their every move. One dragon lunged again, this time faster, but the human ducked low and delivered a crushing blow to its underbelly. The dragon let out a screech of pain, stepping back. It wasn't used to feeling pain, not from prey. The others hesitated. For the first time, they began to doubt their confidence. This human was not like the others. The alien captors watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. They had assumed the dragons would wipe the human out quickly. It was a simple plan: lock the human in with the beasts and let nature take its course. But the way the human fought, how he managed to dodge and strike, was something the aliens hadn't counted on. There was no fear in him. Instead, he was as much a predator as the creatures they had locked him in with. The dragons moved again, this time in unison, their attacks faster and more coordinated. The human dodged once more, this time ducking under a dragon's jaws and using its own weight to his advantage. With a swift motion, he grabbed a jagged rock from the floor and shoved it deep into the dragon's side. The beast howled in agony, its scales no match for the sharp rock embedded in its flesh. The other dragons backed off, circling, eyeing the human with growing respect. They had thought he was just a weak human, an easy meal. But now they were beginning to realize that this human wasn't afraid of them. He had something they had never expected, a primal instinct for survival and an anger that burned brighter than any flame. The human stood there, breathing heavily, but his eyes were sharp. He knew this was only the beginning. More dragons would come, and he had to be ready. The aliens watched, transfixed. They had thought they could control the human, but they were witnessing something far more dangerous. They had underestimated him. And now, they were about to see why humans were considered the deadliest creatures in the galaxy. For the human, the fight had only just begun. The battle for survival. The cavern was filled with an eerie silence after the human's first victory. The dragons circled cautiously, their glowing eyes fixed on him with renewed wariness. Their confidence had been shattered. The human, though still outnumbered, stood tall, a mixture of rage and focus in his eyes. Sweat trickled down his brow, but there was no sign of panic. His hands were steady, and he was already preparing for the next wave of attacks. The largest dragon, its black scales glinting in the dim light, let out a deafening roar. The sound echoed off the cavern walls, vibrating through the ground. The other dragons joined in, their growls vibrating the air. It was a warning. They were no longer the predators. They had become the hunted. The human tightened his grip on the jagged rock, still lodged in the side of one dragon. With a swift motion, he pulled it out, wiping the blood off on his already dirty clothes. He knew that no weapon would truly help him in this fight. It was all about strategy, speed, and timing. The dragons were powerful, but their arrogance had blinded them. He could use that against them. One dragon lunged, faster than before, its massive jaws aimed straight for the human's head. But the human was already moving. He ducked, rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws. The dragon crashed into the ground where he had been standing, its body shaking the cavern with its sheer size. Another dragon took its chance. It swept its tail in a wide arc, aiming to knock the human off his feet. But the human was quick. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing onto the dragon's tail as it passed. With a grunt, he swung his weight, using the tail to launch himself toward the creature's exposed back. With incredible strength, he drove his elbow into the dragon's spine, the force reverberating through the beast's bones. The dragon let out a terrifying shriek as it stumbled forward, trying to regain its balance. But the human was relentless. He struck again, targeting the weak spots of the beast, aiming for the joints and vulnerable scales. The other dragons hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether they should continue the attack. This human was different from any prey they had encountered. He was no mere meal. He was a force of nature, fighting with a fury that only Deathworlders seemed to possess. But the dragons could not afford hesitation. They had to finish what they started. The black-scaled dragon roared in fury, its eyes narrowed. It lunged again, this time more strategically, trying to corner the human. But the human wasn't trapped. He had seen the dragon's movements too many times. He knew exactly when to move and where to strike. As the dragon charged, the human ducked and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the beast's jaws. In one swift motion, he grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and flung it directly at the dragon's exposed eye. The stone hit its target, causing the dragon to scream in pain, temporarily blinded. The human didn't waste the opportunity. He dashed forward, using the dragon's momentary blindness to his advantage. With a powerful kick, he slammed his foot into the dragon's side, sending it crashing to the ground. The remaining dragons roared in anger, their eyes now filled with a mix of fear and respect. This human, they realized, wasn't just surviving. He was hunting them. In a desperate bid, the largest of the dragons launched itself into the air, attempting to get above the human and strike from above. The human's eyes tracked the movement, and he didn't hesitate. As the dragon descended, he leaped forward, grabbing the dragon's massive talon as it reached down to claw at him. Using all his strength, he swung his body upward, climbing the dragon's arm. The dragon let out a screech, thrashing violently in an attempt to shake him off. But the human held on tightly, his body moving with incredible agility. As the dragon struggled, the human found the perfect opportunity. With a burst of strength, he drove his elbow into the dragon's throat, causing it to gasp for air. The dragon staggered, losing its balance, and with a final push, the human drove his knee into its chest. The dragon crumpled to the ground, defeated and gasping for breath. The other dragons were now watching with a mix of disbelief and fear. The human had already taken down two of their kind. They were beginning to realize they were no longer the apex predators in this cavern. For a moment, everything was still. The human stood over the fallen dragon, his chest heaving with effort, but his gaze was cold and unyielding. The remaining dragons circled, unwilling to approach. The aliens observing from the shadows were dumbfounded. They had expected the dragons to finish the human quickly. Instead, the human had turned the tables. He was not only surviving, he was dominating. This wasn't a human they had encountered before. This was something different, something far more dangerous. The battle wasn't over yet. The dragons knew it, and the human knew it. But as the remaining dragons looked at him, they could see it in his eyes. He wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything else, was the real terror. The hunt begins. The dragons, now fewer in number and visibly shaken, began to circle again. They were no longer as confident as they once were. The human's attacks had been relentless, strategic, and deadly. He was different, unlike anything they had faced before. Their leader, the largest black-scaled dragon, growled low in its throat, its eyes locked onto the human. It was clear that this was no longer a hunt. It had become a battle for dominance. The alien observers, hidden behind the shadows of the cavern, were watching intently. The human had turned the tide of the battle with nothing but his raw skill and ferocity. This was not just survival, it was a statement. The human was showing them that they had underestimated him. And now, they would pay the price. The remaining dragons were visibly torn. They had been trained to hunt and destroy, to fight with the savagery of their species. But this human had bested them in ways they had never anticipated. Their leader's low growl echoed through the cavern, signaling the rest of the pack to fall back. But the human, relentless as ever, wasn't going to give them a chance to regroup. He dashed forward, using the natural terrain to his advantage. The cavern was filled with jagged rocks and steep cliffs, the perfect environment for a man with the agility of a predator. He was no longer reacting. He was taking control. Each step he took, each move he made, was calculated. He was hunting them now. One of the dragons, younger and smaller than the others, tried to lunge at the human from the side. It underestimated him, thinking the human was distracted. But the human was always aware, always watching. With a swift motion, he grabbed a jagged piece of stone from the ground and hurled it at the dragon. The rock struck the dragon in the eye, and with a roar of pain, the beast staggered back. Before the dragon could recover, the human was on top of it. He moved with lightning speed, his hands finding the weak spots in the dragon's armor-like scales. With a quick strike, he drove his fist into the dragon's throat, causing it to choke and gasp for air. The dragon struggled, its massive wings thrashing wildly. But the human was relentless, pushing forward with all his might. He didn't give the dragon a chance to fight back. With one final push, the human drove the stone into the beast's heart, silencing its roar. The dragon crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The human stood over the fallen creature, breathing heavily, his gaze never leaving the other dragons that circled warily around him. The leader of the dragons hissed in anger, its fiery eyes glaring at the human. The remaining dragons hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. They had never faced an opponent like this. The human was no longer a mere prey. He was an equal, a challenger who refused to be broken. They were no longer in control of the situation. The human had taken the reins of this battle, and they were struggling to keep up. The cavern was silent for a moment, as if the dragons were contemplating their next move. They had always believed that they were the apex predators, but now they were questioning everything they had known. The human had proven that their strength, their size, and their power were not invincible. The human, with his ingenuity and sheer will to survive, had turned the tide in his favor. The alien observers, who had watched with growing concern, knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. The human had done the impossible. He had not only survived, but had thrived. They had expected to see a broken, beaten creature begging for mercy, but instead they had witnessed a man who had become the true predator of the cavern. The human was a force unlike anything they had ever encountered, and they could not ignore it any longer. The leader dragon, its pride wounded, roared again, louder this time. The sound reverberated through the cavern, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The other dragons, though hesitant, followed suit, letting out a united roar that echoed off the walls. It was a challenge. They would not go down without a fight. The human, now standing tall amidst the fallen dragons, knew this would be the final showdown. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The battle had reached its peak. The dragons had made their move, and now it was his turn. He could feel the weight of his decisions, the culmination of all his efforts. He was ready. With a final glance at the remaining dragons, the human began to move, his every step calculated, his every action purposeful. He was no longer the prey. He was the hunter. The dragons had awakened the beast within him, and now they would learn just how dangerous humanity could be. The air was thick with tension. The final battle was about to begin. The final showdown. The cavern was now a battlefield, a dark, foreboding arena where the air hummed with the promise of violence. The leader dragon, its massive form towering above the others, snarled as it took a step forward, its claws scraping against the rocky ground. The remaining dragons, bloodied and battered, gathered behind their leader. The arrogance that had once defined them was now replaced with a nervous energy that hummed through their ranks. They had underestimated the human, and now they feared him. The human stood tall, his stance unyielding. His breathing was steady, his heart racing in time with the adrenaline surging through his veins. The dragons had expected a weaker prey, someone who would cower, someone who would run. Instead, they had found a warrior, someone who fought not just to survive, but to dominate. The very thought of facing him again struck fear into the hearts of the remaining dragons. With a mighty roar, the leader dragon charged, its wings unfurled and its jaws snapping with the intent to kill. The force of its movement shook the ground beneath the human's feet. The human didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. Instead, he crouched low, waiting, calculating. The dragon was fast, but the human had something the beast didn't: brains. As the dragon lunged, jaws open wide to bite, the human rolled to the side with a speed that surprised even the aliens watching from the shadows. The dragon's massive jaws missed by mere inches, but it didn't stop there. It quickly turned, swiping its claws through the air, trying to catch the human. The claws grazed his side, but the human was already moving again. He was smaller, faster, and more unpredictable than the dragons, and that made him a more dangerous adversary. The human's eyes locked onto the dragon's weak points, the soft underside of its neck, the space between its wings, the joints in its limbs. He wasn't just fighting the dragon. He was studying it, finding every flaw, every opening. The human had faced countless dangers before, but this was personal. These dragons had taken him as nothing more than prey, and now they would know what it meant to face a human, a deathworlder. With a quick movement, the human grabbed a shard of rock from the ground. It wasn't much, but in his hands, it became a weapon as deadly as any sword. He lunged, aiming for the dragon's exposed underbelly, but the dragon was quick to react, twisting its body to block the strike. The human barely dodged a fatal swipe of its claw, but he was relentless. He didn't give up, not even for a moment. The leader dragon's patience was running thin. With a roar of frustration, it surged forward, using its massive body to slam into the human with incredible force. The human was thrown back, crashing into the stone wall of the cavern. For a moment, the world spun around him, but he quickly regained his bearings. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he didn't feel pain, not yet. He knew that this battle could not be won with speed alone. He needed to end it now. The human, now bruised but undeterred, gripped the rock shard in both hands and stood. He was ready. The dragons were circling again, sensing his moment of weakness, but they didn't know that he was only growing stronger. With every strike, every close call, he was learning. He was adapting. And soon, they would understand that this human wasn't just another prey to be hunted. He was the apex predator. The human moved with precision, his eyes never leaving the leader dragon. The others were still recovering, but the leader had become his focus. It was the strongest of them all, the one who would decide this battle. It was time to end it. The human sprinted forward, narrowly avoiding a swipe of the dragon's tail, and launched himself at the creature's head. With a roar, the human drove the rock shard into the soft spot behind the dragon's eye. The leader dragon staggered, momentarily stunned. The human pressed the advantage, twisting the shard and driving it deeper. The dragon roared in agony, its massive body thrashing wildly. It was no longer in control. The human had struck its heart. But the battle wasn't over yet. The remaining dragons, seeing their leader falter, let out a collective roar of rage. They weren't about to let one of their own fall without a fight. The human could feel their eyes on him, their hatred burning through the cavern. He was surrounded, but he wasn't afraid. This was his moment. The human gripped his weapon tighter, his muscles tensed, and his heart pounded in his chest. The dragons were stronger, larger, and far more numerous, but they had one weakness: their pride. They had underestimated him, and now they would pay for it. In that moment, as the dragons charged, the human's mind raced. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for dominance. The fight would end with his victory, and the dragons would learn that no creature, no matter how powerful, could survive against a human in the wilds of their own lair. The final showdown had begun. The last stand. The cavern, once a quiet and seemingly endless space, had now transformed into a ring of death. The air was thick with tension, each dragon poised to strike, each one silently calculating the end of their foe. The human stood in the center of this storm, a figure of resilience and power. His chest heaved with every breath, his body battered and bruised, but his spirit was unbroken. The fight was far from over, but he had already come too far to turn back. The leader dragon, now mortally wounded but not defeated, lurched toward him, its massive form swaying with each agonizing step. Its piercing eyes locked onto the human, filled with fury and desperation. The other dragons, sensing the shift in the battle, began to close in, surrounding the human in a tightening circle. The weight of their gaze was suffocating, but the human felt nothing but fire in his veins. For a moment, everything was still. The dragons waited, watching for any sign of weakness. But the human, he didn't falter. Instead, he grinned through the blood and sweat, his eyes gleaming with a fire they had never seen in any creature before. The leader dragon roared in fury, its wings flapping with a force that sent gusts of wind sweeping across the cavern. It lunged forward, mouth wide open, ready to deliver the killing blow. But the human was faster. In one fluid motion, he ducked beneath the beast's jaws, darting around its massive body like a shadow. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear, calculating every move. With a ferocity born of a lifetime of hardship, the human struck. He thrust his shard of rock into the dragon's underbelly with all the strength he could muster. The blade sank deep, drawing a deafening roar of agony from the dragon. It thrashed violently, but the human held his ground, twisting the shard deeper into the creature's flesh. For a moment, it seemed as if time stood still. The dragon's blood spilled onto the cold cavern floor, and the once mighty creature's roars grew weaker. The other dragons hesitated, watching as their leader was brought to its knees. The sight was unimaginable. Dragons, creatures of legend, brought down by a single human. The shock rippled through their ranks, breaking the battle rhythm. But even as the leader dragon stumbled, the others were not yet finished. One by one, they charged, their claws slicing through the air, their massive jaws snapping at the human. They were furious, and now they were desperate. The human knew the fight was far from over, but he was prepared. With a deep breath, he spun, dodging the swipe of a dragon's tail. He was quick, agile, and had learned from every mistake. The dragons, despite their power, were slow in comparison. He darted between their massive bodies, landing blow after blow on the soft underbellies and wings of his opponents. It was chaos. The cavern was alive with the sound of battle, roars of rage and pain echoing off the stone walls. The human moved like lightning, a blur of motion that confused and disoriented the dragons. They were not used to such speed, such unpredictability. One dragon, slower than the rest, lunged toward him, hoping to trap him in a corner. But the human saw it coming. With a burst of energy, he slid beneath the dragon's attack and drove the shard deep into its exposed throat. The dragon's eyes widened in shock as it crumpled to the ground, its final breath rattling in its chest. Another one down. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining dragons were relentless, their hunger for vengeance dragging them forward. The human could feel his energy waning, his body begging for rest. The bruises, the cuts, the exhaustion, they were all catching up to him. But he refused to stop. Not now. Not when victory was within reach. The next dragon attacked with a deafening roar, swinging its massive tail with deadly precision. The human leaped to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. He didn't have time to think, only to act. He dove forward, using the momentum of his roll to drive the shard upward into the creature's belly. The dragon let out a roar of pain and fury, but it was too late. It staggered back, its strength fading, before collapsing onto the stone floor, lifeless. The cavern fell silent. The human stood amidst the wreckage, the dead dragon scattered around him. His breath was ragged, his body covered in bruises and blood, but he was victorious. The dragons, creatures feared across the galaxy, had met their match in a single human. The last of the dragons, the largest one, stood at the edge of the cavern, watching him. Its eyes burned with hatred, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear. The human had destroyed their pride. He had proved that they were not invincible. With one final roar, the last dragon charged, its jaws open wide. The human didn't flinch. He raised his rock shard, his heart pounding with the thrill of the final battle. The dragon was strong, but the human had something far greater: willpower. The human struck first, slamming the shard into the dragon's throat with precision. The beast's roar was cut short as it crumpled to the ground, its life extinguished in a single blow. And just like that, it was over. The human stood victorious in the lair of the dragons, surrounded by their fallen bodies. The battle had been brutal, but he had proven something that would echo through the galaxy. No one, no matter how powerful, could defeat a human when pushed to the edge. The human had won, and the galaxy would never forget his name. The echoes of victory, the silence that followed the battle was almost unnatural. The only sound was the hum of the distant cave's stalactites as the air shifted, and the drip of water from the cave's ceiling, now tainted with the blood of the fallen dragons. The stench of their defeat lingered in the air, thick with the scent of scorched scales and the pungent tang of death. The human stood still, his breathing shallow but steady. His body ached, every movement sending waves of pain through his bruised form, but the fire in his eyes remained strong. His hands, now slick with dragon blood, gripped the shard of stone tightly. There was no joy in the victory, only the cold, unshakable certainty of survival. Despite the overwhelming odds, the human had defeated them all. The dragons, the greatest warriors in the galaxy, were nothing compared to the relentless spirit of a Deathworlder. This victory wasn't just about strength. It was about willpower, determination, and the fury of a being pushed to the edge. The dragons had underestimated him, thinking him weak because of his form, but now they were nothing but smoldering corpses in the cavern. As the adrenaline began to fade, the human took a cautious step forward, surveying the dead. The last dragon's body lay crumpled at his feet, its blood pooling around its massive frame. He felt nothing but the weight of the moment, the immense cost of victory. This was the price of survival, and it had been paid in full. But the human was not alone. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the cavern, eyes glinted in the dark, watching him. He could feel the presence, like a cold breeze against the back of his neck. He wasn't alone. The dragons had allies. A soft scraping sound echoed through the cavern, a low growl vibrating the stone. His grip tightened around the shard of stone, instinctively preparing for another fight. His body was battered and bruised, but there was no way he would back down. Not now. A shape emerged from the shadows, towering and monstrous. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing its true form, another dragon. But this one was different. Its scales were darker, its eyes more intelligent, more calculating. It wasn't just another beast. It was something more, something far more dangerous. The human's heart skipped a beat as he saw the size of the creature. This was no ordinary dragon. This one had been watching from the darkness, waiting for its moment to strike. It had witnessed the fall of its kin and was now seeking revenge. It was faster, more cunning, and its power was unlike anything the human had faced before. The air grew thick with tension, every breath drawn between them laced with the promise of another battle. The new dragon, larger and far more deadly than the others, spread its wings, the membrane stretching between its massive limbs like sails in the wind. It released a low, rumbling growl, its fangs flashing in the faint light. For a moment, the human hesitated, wondering if he could even survive another fight. His energy was drained. His body ached. But then, the fire that had driven him through the battle with the other dragons flared to life once again. He was a Deathworlder. He didn't give up, not even in the face of impossible odds. The dragon lunged first, snapping its jaws in an attempt to crush him with a single bite. But the human was quicker, ducking beneath the attack and rolling out of the way. He gritted his teeth, standing to face the beast head-on. He was outnumbered, wounded, but he would not go down without a fight. The dragon's tail whipped through the air like a battering ram, but the human dodged it with agility born of necessity. He scrambled toward the nearest pile of broken stone, using the environment to his advantage. Every move was deliberate, precise. The human wasn't fighting with brute force anymore. He was fighting with cunning, using every scrap of knowledge and experience he had. The dragon circled him, its claws scraping the stone floor, its massive wings beating the air with a thunderous sound. The human could feel the ground shaking beneath his feet. The beast was relentless, its power overwhelming. But the human, battered and exhausted, knew he couldn't fight it the same way he had fought the others. He had to be smarter, faster. Just as the dragon lunged for him again, the human leaped to the side, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground and throwing it directly at the creature's eyes. The dragon roared in pain, momentarily blinded by the impact. That was all the human needed. With a flash of movement, he ran forward, slashing the rock shard deep into the dragon's exposed underbelly. The dragon screeched in agony, its wings flailing as it tried to dislodge the human. But the human was already there, pushing deeper into the wound. He had no time to waste. Every second counted. With one final, devastating thrust, the shard punctured the creature's heart, and the massive beast collapsed to the ground with a final, mournful cry. The cavern fell silent once again. The human stood over the dragon's lifeless body, panting heavily, the weight of the battle sinking in. He had won. Again. But even as he stood victorious, he knew the war was far from over. He had slain the last of the dragons, but there were more threats waiting for him, hidden, lurking in the darkness, waiting to see if the human would break. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and it was clear now more than ever. Humans were not to be trifled with. The human's eyes narrowed. He wasn't done yet, and neither was the galaxy. He had just begun. The aftermath, and the true enemy. The dragon's body lay still, its massive form crumpled in a heap at the foot of the cave. The once mighty creature, feared across the galaxy, was now nothing more than a corpse, its blood soaking the cold stone beneath it. The human stood over the fallen beast, his chest heaving with exhaustion, yet his eyes burned with an unyielding fire. He wiped the blood from his hands, but the stains remained, both on his body and on his soul. There was no victory celebration, no cheering crowds to witness the fall of the dragons. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the cave's ceiling and the distant echo of his footsteps on the stone floor. The smell of blood and death hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But the human knew that this battle was just one chapter in a much larger story. The galaxy had witnessed his strength, his tenacity, and his unrelenting drive. But there were still questions unanswered. The dragons had been fierce, but they had been only one part of a much larger puzzle. The dragon's defeat was a warning to all those who dared challenge humanity's place in the universe. As the human looked around the dark cave, he could sense that something was watching him. It wasn't the dragons. It wasn't the creatures that had tried to kill him in the depths of the lair. No, this was something else, something deeper, more sinister. The human wasn't just a survivor. He was a symbol of what humanity had become. The galaxy had underestimated them for far too long, thinking of humans as nothing more than primitive creatures, inferior to the great spacefaring civilizations. But the dragons, the so-called masters of the galaxy, had learned the hard way that humanity was not so easily broken. And now, the galaxy would see that lesson in full. But this victory came at a cost. The human's wounds were deep, his body battered and bruised. His muscles ached, and his vision blurred as he took slow, measured breaths. He had survived, but at what price? The pain from his injuries was almost unbearable, but he refused to show weakness. In the depths of the cave, there was no room for weakness, no time for self-pity. There was only survival. Suddenly, the ground trembled. A low, menacing growl reverberated through the cave, shaking the very walls. The human's eyes darted around, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. His heart raced, and every nerve in his body screamed for him to run. But he stood his ground. There was nowhere to run, not anymore. He had faced death and survived, but now something far more dangerous was closing in. The tremors grew stronger. The sound of footsteps, heavy, thunderous, echoed from deep within the cave. The human tensed, his mind racing. It wasn't the dragons. It wasn't just another predator. This was something else, something more. And it was coming for him. He could feel it now. This was no longer about the dragons, the lair, or even the galaxy's greatest warriors. This was about survival in its purest form. The true enemy had arrived. Out of the shadows, something enormous emerged, a creature that dwarfed the dragons in size and ferocity. Its eyes glowed like twin suns, burning with malice and intelligence. Its massive body was covered in thick, spiked armor, and it moved with a predator's grace. The human's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any creature. It was the apex predator, the true ruler of this dark realm. The creature let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the cave, its voice vibrating through the stone and into the human's bones. The human's mind raced, calculating his odds. But deep down, he knew. This was a battle unlike any other. The human's grip tightened on the jagged rock shard he had used to slay the dragons. His pulse quickened. There was no turning back now. He had fought to survive, to prove his worth. But this was something different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far more important. It was about winning. The creature lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from the human's face. The human dodged just in time, his body moving on pure instinct. The cave seemed to close in around him as he rolled away, barely escaping the creature's deadly bite. He couldn't let fear take hold. Not now. Not when the stakes were higher than ever. He had fought through countless battles, defeated the dragons, and survived against all odds. But this would be his greatest test. The human's heart raced, his breath shallow but steady. He could hear the creature's growls echoing in the darkness, feel the heat of its breath on his skin. It was stronger than any opponent he had faced, but the human wasn't afraid. He was Deep-Worlder. He didn't fear anything. As the creature charged again, the human sprang into action. He was faster, more agile than the beast, and with a well-timed strike, he plunged the shard of rock deep into its side. The creature screeched in pain, staggering back. But the fight was far from over. The human gritted his teeth, ready for the final confrontation. His body was ached, his vision blurred, but his spirit, his will to survive, was unshaken. He had fought, he had bled, and now he would show the galaxy what it meant to face a Death-Worlder. This time, he would not just survive. He would conquer. The true battle had only just begun.